Much, Johan, for this very interesting talk, and thank you for inviting me for talking here today. I'm Nanna, Jørgensen, and well, I'm gonna give a presentation. Well, now we're gonna go into some more kind of specific research. I'm not presenting something very overall, that like what Johan did, but more on my specific research team and this question of uncertainty that I have been working with for a period. Just to give you a little bit of background, I'm a social anthropologist with a PhD in education for sustainable development, and currently I'm employed as a researcher at the University College UCC in Copenhagen. My previous research has been on education and livelihoods in southern and eastern Africa, and currently I'm working on refugee families and preschool education in Denmark. Let me see if I can shift the slide. Here we go. So my approach to studying sustainability education, and perhaps also education more generally, takes people's everyday lives as point of departure rather than educational interventions. What I'm interested in is the ways in which people draw on different kinds of knowledge and learning experiences in their attempts to cope with sustainability challenges. And then I'm specifically interested in global perspectives that Johan was also talking about right now, and in empirical research. And as you will hear, my empirical research is kind of this everyday life research. Theoretically, I'm in particular inspired by phenomenology and phenomenologically inspired anthropology, but I also draw on other ways of thinking. And in this presentation, I'll discuss the experiences of increased uncertainty following in the wake of climate change, which mark the everyday lives of many people across the globe. I'm drawing on empirical examples from Eastern and Southern Africa, and I'll discuss how people in different contexts negotiate knowledge and learning in their attempts to manage uncertainty related to livelihoods. This seems maybe far away from the Nordic context that we are talking in right now, but I think that these stories from elsewhere also bring some insights that are quite relevant to ourselves and our own lives. We can perhaps discuss that afterwards if that makes sense for you. Uncertainty is a theme that seems to be cutting across the different research themes that I have been focusing on in my work. But I'm still far from any kind of clear conclusions on this topic. So I'm going to present you some of my thoughts, and you could see it as an invitation for further reflection and discussion. So what I'll do now is to start out very briefly and short to outline how I think about uncertainty, agency, and learning. And afterwards, I'll bring in some of the empirical examples from my research and use them to reflect upon how uncertainty and learning and agency interact and relate in concrete situations. So, when we talk about uncertainty in relation to climate change, we quite often think about the uncertainty of scientific knowledge about climate change and its consequences. In this presentation, my understanding of uncertainty is drawing on anthropological and phenomenological perspectives, as I'm focusing on the lived experience of uncertainty in relation to everyday life survival and coping. The uncertainty experienced by people in their everyday lives links up to climate change, but also to complex interactions between climate, environment, economy, politics, and sociality. Cooper and Praxton, in their book on ethnographies of uncertainty in Africa, have defined uncertainty as the lived experience of a pervasive sense of vulnerability, anxiety, hope, and possibility, mediated through the material assemblages that underpin, saturate, and sustain everyday life. And furthermore, they suggest that uncertainty about issues that matter catalyzes imaginations as well as practices. So in other words, experiences of uncertainty do something to people's agency. Sandra Calkins, who recently published a book on uncertainty among pastoralists in Sudan, suggests with inspiration from Dewey that uncertainty and responses to uncertainty are closely entangled, and that actions to manage uncertainty should be conceived of as testing and experimenting. Calkins points to the universality as well as the unequal distribution of experiences of uncertainty. And she's suggesting that uncertainty is a rendering of realities which can lead to innovations and creative solutions, but also can debilitate people through fear and unease, impairing the ability to act. This is the quote that you see here on my slide and that I'm going to come back to later in the presentation. Following Boltanski, Calkins proposed that uncertainty entails the questioning of reality and opens up a horizon to imagine other social arrangements. In other words, uncertainty destabilizes the social and material realities we take for granted and provides agency with an experimental character. So just very few words on agency and learning, because the concept of agency, of course, is closely connected to this analytical dialectic between social structure and actor, which underlies key discussions in social science theory, for instance, in the work of Bourdieu and Giddens, and more lately Archer. And agency has often been discussed with a focus on social reproduction, a focus on how knowledge is passed on with minor adaptations from generation to generation. And a phenomenological perspective on agency brings attention to its embodied aspects. Merleau-Ponty has suggested that the exercise of will emerges from our embodied, situated being in a material and social world. Merleau-Ponty also describes embodied learning as a process in which previous experiences are sedimented in our bodies as habits. Our experience of the world thus simultaneously involves direct and past experience. As embodied beings, we are anchored in the past, but also oriented towards the future, as habits always anticipate a particular future. So habits are transformed and learning occurs when new present circumstances, there could be new social or material situations, emotional disturbances, new anticipations of the future, when these kind of things reorient our relations to the world. So when life conditions are experienced as very uncertain and as in rapid change, forms of agency change and new kinds of learning occur. And then people draw on past experiences and newly acquired ones in new ways. So let me move to my empirical examples, then maybe be more clear why I'm talking about this. For my PhD research, I was doing fieldwork in Laikipia North in northern Kenya. And I did the fieldwork in 2012 and 2014. And here I met young people from pastoralist communities who were increasingly turning to other livelihood activities than livestock keeping, which had been sort of what they did before, because of droughts and pressure on land and vegetation changes in the area. And one group of young men that I met primarily earned their living from loading sand sold to the construction industry elsewhere in Kenya. Their activities were looked upon as morally problematic by many in the elder generation, in part because selling sand was considered equal to selling land, which was considered a taboo, but also because it had negative impact on the availability of water. The young men had grown up herding animals, and some had gone to school for a few years. And what struck me when I was interacting with them was their lack of occupation with attempting to plan for the future. They spent much of the time waiting for a job to come their way, as you can see here on the photo. They were hanging out in town in order to be available. So their agency appears similar to what Jørgensen describes as judicious opportunism, with a little bit difficult word. And she's talking about young educated women in Cameroon in the context of heavy economic and social crisis. Dealing with uncertain futures, instead of rationalizing, actors take advantage of whatever means are available, Jørgensen suggests. This implies keeping options open, maintaining possibilities, keeping flexible, and then being ready to pounce when a promising chance comes along. So the young men I met in Laikipia North in many ways seemed stuck. The knowledge on pastoralism which they carried with them was not adequate for taking up new livelihood activities. And while, of course, through sand loading they had learned to use their bodies in new ways, they had very little control over their livelihood situation and their livelihood opportunities, because the sand trade depended on the availability of sand and on local politics, and on the demand, which was rather unpredictable. So in Laikipia North, I also met young men who acted in a different way vis-a-vis the uncertainty. Rather than waiting for things to come their way, they constantly worked on new plans for how to earn money through marketing natural resources or creating. Sorry, I'm just seeing now that you can't hear me properly. Is this better? I'll try to go on. Sorry, man. That's really a pity. Okay. I hope you heard a little bit of what I was trying to say until now. Otherwise, I'll have to do it another time. Well, so I also met these. Good. Okay. So I met these young men who were constantly making plans. For instance, through marketing natural resources or creating projects with NGOs in the area. So this doesn't really mean that they worked with a means-end rationality, which, according also to Johnson Hanks, posits actions in which the actor selects a specific desired end and then use the available means as efficiently as possible to achieve it. Rather, the young men I met were planning, scheming, imagining, and trying things out in various directions, focusing their attention on how available material resources may be used to reach or connect them to a desirable future. As such, you could say that their agency appears largely in line with what Henrik V has called social navigation, which he describes as encompassing both the assessment of the dangers and possibilities of one's present position, as well as the process of plotting and attempting to actualize routes into uncertain and changeable futures. So these young men were drawing on their school knowledge and on things that they had learned through engaging with outsiders, as well as on their knowledge of the local situation, on the social relations and politics in the area, as well as their knowledge on the environmental features in the local area. Yet their actions were, in effect, in many cases contributing to the undermining of livelihoods in their region, as for instance when their ability to market the sand increased the exploitation and the resource and had negative effects on the availability of water, and also added to social conflict in the area. So while my first story was an example on how uncertainty almost impaired people's ability to act, as their knowledge and experience appeared largely inadequate for the new situation, then in the second story, young people were drawing on different kinds of knowledge and tried out different kinds of actions. But unfortunately, in the process of finding creative solutions, they also created or intensified social conflicts, and perhaps in particular generational conflicts. And then I'm coming to my last example, which points to what seemed to be a more successful way of dealing with uncertainty. So 16 years ago, I carried out my master thesis research on urban gardening in South Africa, and recently Lektor and I had and all the people from the DPU had a collaboration with Jordt University on climate change and change agency, collective learning, and then I visited South Africa again. And there I visited people who had started up gardening projects in rural areas in attempts to deal with livelihood challenges brought about by climatic change, but also economic and political processes. And here I met a number of young people who were involved in gardening projects, but there were also elder people who played a special role in the gardening groups as organizers and mediators of knowledge. These elder gardeners had been involved in garden work as children, but none of them had spent much time as cultivators in their adult lives. And in that way, you could say that their experiences did not really match the current situation of water scarcity and climate variability that has intensified the last decades. Yet they did actually manage to take up a position of authority as cultivators in relation to young people. So the elder gardeners had been successful in linking up with local farmers and gardeners, as well as with external agents, on accessing knowledge useful for their gardening and passing it on to younger people through activities in the gardens. Lade and Wenger, in their writings on apprenticeship learning, describe a certain type of generational learning in which younger persons is learning from the skills and practices of the older master. But in this case, the elder gardeners cannot really be considered masters of cultivation. Rather, they are successful mediators of knowledge who are willing to test and experiment with new gained knowledge through trial and error, as one of them said. Mark Nuttall, in his work on climate change in Greenland, has drawn attention to the role of anticipation in local strategies of adaptation to a more and more uncertain environment. Anticipation is about drawing on experiences and skills in the process of finding one's way in the world, and it involves the connection of several temporal points. Inuits, Nuttall argues, have not just adapted to their environment, they anticipate the possibilities and conditions for successful engagement with it. And then he continues with the quote that you see on the slide, that successful anticipation depends to a certain extent on the ability to act on previous experience and apply knowledge to new situations and forms of engagement. So the elder gardeners in South Africa appear to have a talent for the kind of anticipation described by Nuttall. By drawing on different kinds of knowledge and installing themselves as knowledge mediators, they were able to navigate in an environment which offered certain possibilities for cultivation. To the young people who followed the elders, the activities in the gardens appeared to offer openings of hope and potentiality. Farming generally seemed to be looked upon as backwards among young people in South Africa, but the young people in the gardens talked about how gardening connected them to their roots and to their forefathers, while also offering a way of gaining an income and thus a brighter future. The elder gardeners were coping with the uncertainty of livelihoods by drawing on different kinds of knowledge which was applied to a new situation and by creating new kinds of intergenerational relations. I'm coming to the end now, Stefan, you don't have to be stressed. In conclusion, the young sandloaders in northern Kenya addressed uncertainty through flexibility and experimenting. So they attempted to keep options open and relations ambiguous, and their agency could thus be considered kind of an agency of ambiguity. Acknowledging ambiguity in agency means questioning dominant ideas about reflected rational choices and decisions. This does not necessarily mean that agency precludes reflective thoughts and planning, but these intertwine with other more improvisatory ways of operating. Going somewhere, Ingold and Hallam has suggested, requires continuous maneuvering, improvisational adjustments and attunements in relation to other people and to the world. Yet the maneuvering of these young people resulted in quite a number of conflicts and contradictions. Hastrup and Olvey has suggested that managing new kinds of uncertainty is not just a matter of developing new technical ways of living in an environment, but also about developing new kinds of sociality. And the intergenerational interactions in the gardens of South Africa is perhaps an example of this. The elder gardeners do not possess an unambiguous authoritative knowledge, but their generational position in these new kind of social groups that have been created and their experiences from different places enable them to mediate and experiment with knowledge. For educators, these kinds of empirical examples illuminate that the way in which environmental knowledge is brought into use is not only a question of the didactics or the pedagogies employed in educational activities, but also of the way in which the knowledge connects to a wider social, cultural, and material context. Experiences of uncertainty, I suggest, is an aspect of life that educators have to deal with. And a key educational challenge of life in times of climate change is to support the processes through which uncertainty becomes a catalyst of innovations and creative solutions, rather than of fear or unease impairing people's ability to act, to come back to Colkin's quote. So, that's it.